Okay. Our last speaker of this session is Yoon Emily Wang, who's a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at the University of Toronto, where her research is supported by a doctoral Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship from SSHRC, which is the Social Science Humanity Research Council of Canada, the same organization which is supporting our conference here. And yeah, go SSHRC, and congratulations on the fellowship. Emily's dissertation examines the ways in which people use sound, speech, and music to mediate their construction, maintenance, and experiences of various spaces that they call home, with case studies from the margins of Toronto's Chinese diaspora. Let's see. Okay. All right. That's the UBC thing. We're going to get going here. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for two wonderful talks. Such anxiety following your genius. Anyways, shortly after I had shown my friend and interlocutor Aren an earlier version of the analysis that constitute my paper today, he brought up the word queer in a casual conversation. Aren belongs to a group of friends with whom I have been conducting participant observation for several years. Members of this mixed gender group are all queer-identifying Taiwanese transplants living in Toronto in their 30s, and I, an ethnographer at home, have been studying a sonically distinct verbal style that circulates within the group and demarcates the group's borders. This verbal style can perhaps be described as possessing a sort of heightened musicality with unusually large prosodic variations, the rise and falls of speech tones and so forth, and the rhythmic cadence. I've been trying to understand the relationship between this verbal style and the group members' negotiation between queerness, diasporicness, and cultural Chineseness in the context of Canadian multiculturalism. In our conversation, I asked Aren if he feels like this verbal style is linked to his queer identification. Aren contemplated for a while and said that perhaps we should take a step back and examine what queer really means first. He describes queer as an aesthetic for deliberate, playful moves in response to various manifestations of normative in his daily life. I asked him to elaborate, and he said, well, okay, you notice that when we talk in this group and when we talk in this queer style that you analyze, we're always talking about the most trivial shenanigans, content-wise. Things that doesn't matter, the things that are not important. I think that's intentional, and the little things we talk about in this queer way won't hurt anyone, and there's no danger of getting into real trouble, and we still get to invoke this queer thing together. Still baffled, and to be honest, a little bit was maybe trying to make sense of all this in the context of books I read and such. I asked if he felt like there is a totalizing regime of heteronormativity that only permits this queer verbal style when the content of the conversation is inconsequential. Aren said, well, I guess you could say that, but I think the more important thing here is that your polarization of queer and normative doesn't really mean much to me. It's not about dismantling the structure. I know that's how a lot of queer politics work, but for me, a version of queer that makes more sense would be, I know the game, I know how to play the game, I know how to mess up the game under the table, and I also know how far I can mess it up and still win the game. Me, choose when I play alone and when I push back. I choose. I have to survive at the end of the day. That's a simple way to put all of this. I have a life to live, I want the same things everybody wants, and that doesn't mean I can't loosen a few screws on the metaphorical machine when no one is watching, and get a kick out of doing so. My paper today is an effort to explore the theoretical nuance and to demonstrate the expressive possibilities in this iteration of queerness that Aren had articulated. In the following sections, I will do three things. First, I frame Aren's iteration of queerness, characterized by its implicitness, in Helen Liang's concept of queer undercurrents. Or, as she said, an undertow of unease that refuses to allow the surface calm to settle. I situate this reading in literature on queer diaspora and works that theorize queerness in the Chinese-speaking context. Second, I tease out some of the ways in which queer undercurrents manifest in a stylized verbal practice common among my group of interlocutors. I describe this practice as a Mandarin adaptation of camp talk, the verbal style iconized as gay man speech in North American popular culture. Lastly, interwoven in my theoretical explorations, I analyzed two examples of Mandarin camp talk in my interlocutor's everyday life in the hopes to demonstrate that even in the most seemingly inconsequential shenanigans, queer politics and possibilities abound. Emerging over the last 2 decades, the ethnomusicology of diaspora has demonstrated the numerous ways in which sound, music, and the performing arts are important venues for identity work in diasporic communities. This importance is in no small part because music, like any other expressive culture, intensifies the diasporic's notion of home and their cultural political engagements with their homeland. Being tethered to a home, often through expressive culture, has consistently been theorized as a defining characteristic of a diaspora and the linchpin in transnational identity formations. But what happens if home is a traumatizing originary site, as may be the case for many queer diasporics? What happens if home is the reason for departure in the first place? And what happens when a diasporic community reproduces the repressions of home? Indeed, as sociologist Anne-Marie Fortier has noted, the multiply displaced queer diaspora compels us to rethink the problematics of home. Fortier argued that queer diaspora constitutes a distinct subjectivity that demands an alternative framework, a new way of thinking about home in diaspora, where queerness is always already encountered. But what queerness should be incorporated into this new conception of home? Queerness as understood in English scholarship has not always been the most welcoming. Writing on queer representations in Taiwan's public culture, Fran Martin has reflected that English term queer and its transliteration in Chinese, queer, often standing for Euro-American-centric queer theory itself. This queer theory becomes a conditioning context that disciplines and displaces rather than liberates the queers who are already living in alterity. And here I'm thinking towards Helen Liang's example, in which she discussed that she was in one of these queer activist kind of events, and then people were telling her, okay, so Hong Kong queer activism is eventually going to catch up, and this harkens back to Chris's comment on teleology and so forth. To that observation and critique, I found film scholar Helen Hockstedt Liang's concept of queer undercurrents an especially useful trope for understanding queer identification in a way that attends sensitively to their social and historical conditions. With queer undercurrents, Liang reframes queer subtext in Hong Kong cinema as a response to Hong Kong's post-colonial conditions. Same-sex desire in these films, like Hong Kong's self-narrative after its 1997 handover to the People's Republic of China, is always there for those in the know to see, but can only remain viable and legible if it remains under wraps. Liang's queer undercurrent, I think, is precisely the type of implicit queerness that my interlocutor Aren articulated in the beginning of my paper. The layers of oppression and marginalization Aren experiences in diaspora parallels Liang's description of Hong Kong under Chinese governance. More importantly, queerness as undercurrent is a way to reconfigure queer politics that relocates its emancipatory potentials to the possibility of disruption. That is, people can create meaning, negotiate their social positions, and form group identity based on something that hasn't necessarily bloomed, sometimes because that's all they could manage without becoming obliterated. An example of how queer undercurrents manifest in my interlocutors' everyday expressions in their transnational lives can be found in a story of mishearing. We had gathered one night over a family-style hot pot dinner to celebrate our friend Jin Tai's return to Toronto from an extended trip back home to Taiwan. Members of this group consider each other chosen family, and like family, we welcome Jin Tai's homecoming from a different home by begging for stories where she embarrassed herself. In one of these stories, Jin Tai told us that she had inadvertently fallen soundly asleep on Taipei's subway system and had woken up in the middle of the subway's well-known quadrilingual announcement, which features a pre-recorded female voice naming each upcoming station in Mandarin, Hoklo, Hakka, and English. When Jin Tai finally came to her senses enough to pay attention to the announcement, that is, to listen, to tune into her sonic environment, she thought she had heard a somewhat ungrammatical Mandarin sentence spoken in the female announcer's voice. That sentence, Jin Tai reported, was 张开穴，摸摸你的后. While still in shock, Jintai's train pulled into a station of architectural grandeur, adorned with flags and solemn portraits of the nation's founding fathers and so forth. Jintai then realized that she had actually misheard the English announcement for Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. Which is the ultimate emblem of Taiwan's contested nationhood. And your response is identical to my interlocutor's response upon hearing this story. Jintai's story of mishearing could, of course, be taken as nothing more than a lowbrow humor that bonds close friends, but I want to suggest an alternative reading in which the misheard sentence operates as a trans-Pacifically circulating translinguistic pun, wherein Jintai and her audience enact the queer undercurrents. And here I'm going to temporarily pause the analysis so as to contextualize Jintai's mishearing in a verbal style that circulates within a group, what I call Mandarin camp talk. Primarily theorized to describe English speakers, the term camp talk has been construed in North American popular culture as a speech pattern that betrays the speaker's male homosexuality. Linguistic anthropologists Deborah Cameron and Don Kulik argue that camp talk can be indexical of queerness because camp talk queers by intentionally creating disjunctures that confront the seemingly stable relationships between sign and meaning, between voices and speakers, and between sounds and scripts. The classic example is how queer men might speak stereotypically with a higher pitched voice and greater prosodic variation, so like more of a background melody, if you will, which are linguistic markers typically mapped onto femininity. My Mandarin-speaking interlocutors adapt many of the same rhetorical strategies in ordering their queer identifications. In addition to the many phonological characteristics that are transferable to Mandarin, the most poignant adaptation is the extensive use of puns, and specifically homophonic puns, that rely on different words sounding the same or very similarly. Homophonic puns are especially suited for Mandarin, which has a high density for homonyms, and numerous idioms and customs are themselves homophonic puns. In speech, puns lend themselves easily for queer expression. They're inherently disruptive as they undermine the ideology of language as a rational system of reference. Puns force us to confront the idea that one sound image can refer to multiple concepts. My interlocutors harness this disruptive potential by constantly making creative puns in Mandarin that introduce alternative possibilities to utterances that are already resounding. And I should mention that these puns are almost always sexual and always dirty. And here's a very quick example where somebody had a nickname, Guo Chang, which could be translated to nation's prosperity, and that's the dominant way to translate this. But in the group, it's understood that they actually meant a homonym, which is nation's prostitute. The creative process of making a homophonic pun involves finding text to fit into a pre-existing sound, which is incidentally not unlike text setting in Chinese opera. To actively make a pun from something that had already been uttered is not only a creative and performative act, but also a political engagement that introduces and highlights that utterance's queer potentiality. This brings me back to Jintai's mishearing, which I argue is a pun, the sounding out of which Jintai had delayed until she was sharing the story with the group. Here, Jintai's alternative text can be heard as queer in several ways. It calls forth an intimate private sexual act that hints at male homosexuality, which is jarringly contrasting both the modern public space and the modern public space that the subway symbolizes, and the Republic of China's governance, of which Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall is iconic. The pun could also be read as a pushback against the instructional voice of the subway announcement, which has been theorized as a form of disciplining national subjects. Finally, the pun harkens to popular discourse in Taiwan that often compares Chiang Kai-shek's dictatorship to forced sexual acts. Recontextualizing Jintai's storytelling in the diaspora, this mishearing is engaging with multiple critical registers that ultimately allows her to queer the homeland. The story of mishearing became an important part of the group's collective identity, told and retold to each other at every gathering. About 6 months later, another group member, Cai Hua, brought back a recording of this very subway broadcast.
Royal Hall Station. Transfer station for line 3. 右侧开本。
So the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall bit is like in the beginning. Cai Hua told me that she had traveled out of her way to capture this announcement because, and I quote, "You know Jintai's story? You remember, don't you?" Jintai's misheard pun then has become an implicit queer undercurrent that circulates along the borders of the group, ready to be invoked at any time, though legible only to those on the inside. And picking up the thread from my earlier discussion on the problematics of home, I posit this pun and its circulation can be understood as a form of queer diasporic homemaking, which shifts the emphasis away from home as a static place and towards making as an orientation. The phrase homemaking can be taken in two different ways. Homemaking can mean to construct a physical, social, cultural space where one finds intimacy, privacy, sense of belonging, and so forth. But homemaking can also mean to make yourself at home, to adapt, to habituate, and to make it work between a rock and a hard place. As an orientation, homemaking relinquishes the insistence to reproduce the imaginary of a homeland in diaspora and instead open new possibilities for being in the world. For my interlocutors, this pun encapsulates homemaking in both senses, building group solidarity while negotiating the difficulties occupying queer Asian bodies in the context of Canadian multiculturalism and homonationalism. On a different night, the group had gotten to, a private suite at a karaoke bar in Toronto's Chinatown, and it looks like this. And lots of singing, drinking, so far. While none of the group members would describe themselves as musicians, all are avid fans of contemporary Mandopop. The unofficial leader of this group, Frank Su, often plays on his family name Su and refers to himself as either Su Shen, or Auntie Su, or its near homonym in English, Susan or Suzanne. As the basis for a whole range of cross-gender nicknames, the poetically alliterated Su Shen also subtly implies a disruption to the Su family structure, where rather than being the eldest son and heir of the Su family, Frank displaces himself through the nickname, taking up the stance of a distant female king, Shen. The group has its own collective karaoke repertoire, and everybody blasts through every song together all the time. But on this night, Frank insisted on breaking out our routine by ordering a relatively new song titled 爱无畏, or Fearless Love, recorded by Mandopop singer Elva. In the karaoke suite, the music video of Fearless Love was projected onto a wall-sized widescreen, just like this one. And Frank plopped himself directly in front of the screen so that Elva's image would be superimposed onto his body. Elva sang from the perspective of a newly infatuated young woman, and through the song lyrics, she urges her fellow supergirls to be fearless in the pursuit of love. The music video, on the other hand, told a different story. The four supergirls, with superpowers, found themselves repeatedly failing at love in catastrophic ways until Elva taught them to contain their own power and to discipline themselves. Disjunct between the oral and the visual, this music video ultimately portrays a failed aspiration to turn patriarchal heteronormativity on its own head. Frank sang with Elva in a falsetto voice, and his entrance into the narrative of the song was reinforced when he started pointing throughout the chorus line. I'll show you in a moment. Group members joined promptly and excitedly screamed in a rhythmic manner. And I'll play.
She's a laser girl. She's dazzling. Nice, nice day. She's sweet. Bouncy girl. Fast as light. Our lady. She's the strongest supergirl.亲爱的 lady， 来陪我坚定，眼前的男生让我有一点点动心。今天的口红替我说什么？像一种不同勇敢点点畏畏缩缩。我不怕有 像冒出了什么，他这一张微笑的眼神，你还没多独特的恋爱是我们别当女生童话故事只是偶像剧情，可是女人要爱就爱 this girl's power. You could be a super girl.
So he went, Supergirl. And here is a little bit of field recording.
Together we can rule the world. You can be a supergirl. 看到天上的爱就爱，不要在乎。真的爱谁爱什么？因为寂寞。I'm a superman.
In our follow-up conversation, Frank confirmed my interpretation that singing the superimposition of Sue Supergirl onto Sue brings out the queer subtext in a whole range of puns on Sue. But more importantly, this pun on which Frank pivots his sung and spoken expressions allows him to put a song on top of it, as ethnomusicologist David Samuels would say, and draw on Elva's perspective in Fearless Love as an expressive framework for his queer subjectivity in the Chinese diaspora. That is, to the extent that he is aware of the possibilities to queer, to dismantle, and to destabilize, Frank's queer identification must ultimately remain an undercurrent, just like the Supergirl's superpowers. On the issue of puns that breach the boundaries of language, David Samuels have suggested that if we loosen the hierarchy between speech and other expressive sounds, we might begin to see the productive resource of ambiguity. Ultimately, through my two ethnographic case studies, I hope to demonstrate the creative and ingenious ways in which my interlocutors call together heterogeneous resources from their everyday life to produce that necessary ambiguity. Through the puns that I have analyzed as part of Mandarin Camp Talk, my interlocutors can performatively enact precisely the kind of socio-historically situated queerness interlocutor Aren articulated at the beginning of my paper. Queerness as possibility, queerness as potential, as implicit ambiguous undercurrents through which they accord their own voices a history of repression, and through which they could make home, even in expressions that seems to be no more than shenanigans. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful paper, for taking us into a karaoke bar. Any questions? Okay, I was wondering.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm fascinated by modes of sociality that like music enables.
Absolutely.
And it seems like this is one such mode that like music facilitates this kind of punnery. I guess my question is, is this mode of sociality amongst you and your friend interlocutors?
Ooh,
There's
like
no
that.
good word for that, but you know what I mean. You and your peeps. Like,
Right.
is there a way in which they can find that mode of sociality in other contexts, say like at family gatherings, or or is it something that is unique to the setting and the people and the sonic presence of music? Like, what are the bounds of, I guess, of this mode of sociality that seems so exciting and liberating and has so much potential?
Thank you for that question, and that's a really good question. I had to cut out a lot of stuff, and so like one of the things that happens is actually that this group of people gather together for hot pot dinner like every week, and during which time there's always background music playing, and so people will be eating, and just like, yes, turnip, and then like just like very smoothly transitioning to singing along and just be like, okay, turnip, and more turnip, and so So this is the kind of thing where you have this like flash of a moment. So that's one example. The other one I could think of is actually that in one of their houses where we always have the hot pot dinner. For Chinese New Year's, we did this like very traditional thing of like writing calligraphy on red strips of paper, and so one of them made a mistake, and he meant to write 一级棒, which I guess means top notch, but he made a mistake, so it actually translates to like gigantic stick. And he kept it up when his mom was visiting. And has said, oh, yeah, well, you know, like, we're terrible at Chinese. Like, look at us, ooh. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I'm curious if you've encountered anything because, sorry. I'm thinking about puns and how much of that requires on like knowing, getting the joke and kind of maintaining those
Absolutely.
boundaries and maintaining that kind of thing. So I'm curious about, you know, new people join, do they have to then catch up, or the kind of not demarcation of those borders of, you know, getting it in that sense.
Totally. That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much. There have been a lot of like people saying trying out is something awful, but like there have been a lot of people who show up once and then never got the invitation again, right? But when I first joined this group and you know and was really worried about getting kicked out and so forth, it did take me a long time before I know all of the puns. So the national prosperity joke, I mean that was like 8 months before I just was like, okay, whatever, you guys like this name, okay. But it wasn't until like 8 months later that I saw it in writing one day that I realized what they were talking about. And then all the like giggles and kind of thing would start to make sense. So it did take a really long time. And a lot of the puns are created in a moment. So if you were in that kind of social situation, you accumulate a repertoire. Yeah.
I just wondering about the kind of, to me that seems a little, like that's an act of fixing it versus, you know, if we're talking about the sort of trans or the circulation of people in this sense, you know, those two seem like that's a way of like locking things down and not policing, but
Totally.
yeah, fixating them in that way.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna have to think more about that. Yeah, but I really love that point. Thanks.
Time for one last question? Okay, well, I'd like to thank our three speakers this morning for a stimulating way to begin the day. All right.